She walked in quietly. They laughed loudly. But this nobody was Australia's richest woman in disguise. And the man who insulted her? His life was about to spiral in ways he never saw coming. The Harbour City auction house glittered with wealth. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above polished marble floors, and champagne flutes clinked softly between Sydney's elite. It was a night of status, ego, and silent competition. Then the atmosphere shifted. The grand doors creaked open, and in stepped an elderly woman. She wore a faded beige coat, scuffed shoes, and carried a worn leather handbag. Her silver hair was pulled into a simple bun. She looked out of place, like an accidental guest in a palace of pride. Heads turned, whispers slithered through the air. Who let her in? Is this a charity event now? Maybe she's here to clean the place. The woman, unfazed, calmly walked toward a large canvas that hung like royalty on the wall. Her eyes studied the strokes, the soul of the painting, as if she saw something others didn't. Thomas, the auctioneer, stood tall nearby. He was in his early 30s, sharp suit, sharper ego. He strutted toward her, voice oozing superiority. "Madam," he said loud enough for others to hear, "this auction is by invitation only. Perhaps the food bank is down the street?" She didn't flinch. "I just wanted to admire the art," she said softly. Thomas chuckled. "Admire it all you want. Just don't touch anything." Laughter rippled through the room. The woman gave a faint smile, nodded respectfully, and stepped back into the shadows of the room. The night carried on, but the seed had been planted. Hours passed. The room grew warmer with excitement as bids soared on rare artifacts and paintings. Thomas danced through the auction like a performer. His voice, his rhythm, his confidence, undeniable. Then came the final piece, the same painting the elderly woman had admired earlier. Thomas's voice rose. "Starting at 100,000, do I hear 150? Hands shot up. The bidding climbed quickly. 200, 300, 450. Then, a calm voice from the back. 500,000. Gasps filled the room. All eyes turned to her, the woman in the faded coat. Thomas blinked. "Madam, are you serious?" She nodded once. He smirked. "Verification of funds will, of course, be necessary." Before she could answer, the room shifted again. The doors swung open. A security detail entered, followed by Gina Reinhardt. Australia's richest billionaire. Power radiated from her. She didn't walk. She commanded space. She moved directly toward the old woman, her expression softening. "Mother," Gina said, "are you all right?" "Yes, Gina," the woman said, "just proving a point." Silence. You could hear the weight of realization crash onto Thomas like a falling chandelier. Gina turned to Thomas, her tone sharp, precise. "You mocked my mother," she said, "in front of strangers, with no information, only assumption." Thomas's throat dried. I didn't know." "You didn't care to know," Gina snapped. "I was considering investing millions into this auction house. I believed it stood for culture, elegance, and dignity. Clearly, I was mistaken." She turned and walked out. One by one, guests followed her. Investors, artists, collectors. They left behind champagne glasses and shattered illusions. Within minutes, the room was half empty, and Thomas stood frozen, alone, humiliated, exposed. In the weeks that followed, the fallout was swift. Clients withdrew their support. Art dealers refused to collaborate. Upcoming events were canceled, and Thomas's reputation became toxic. But rather than self-reflect, his pride twisted into poison. He blamed Gina. He blamed Margaret. In his mind, they had humiliated him. He couldn't see that it was his own arrogance that dug his grave. Bitterness festered. Nights grew long and sleepless. His lavish lifestyle bled away. He sold his car, then his apartment, then his pride, though even that he clung to desperately. Thomas began attending smaller auctions, trying to reclaim lost footing, but no one wanted to work with him. Still, he told himself, lies. They're threatened by me. They're just jealous. It's their loss. But nothing could fill the void. No success came. No art touched his soul anymore. Life had become gray noise. And then the mirror turned. At a small art event in Melbourne, Thomas, now thinner, older, slightly hunched, approached a vibrant young artist to compliment her work. Before he could speak, a tall man in an expensive blazer stepped in. "I'm sorry, sir," the man sneered. "This isn't a space for critics of the past. You don't belong here." Laughter. He had been mistaken for someone beneath them, just like he once mistook Margaret. The irony was a knife, but Thomas didn't recognize it. He walked away grumbling, "They're all fools." Years passed. Thomas, now in his 60s, lived in a small rented room above a bookstore. The walls were bare, the fridge nearly always empty. Art had become just a word. One day, an old friend offered him a small position at a minor gallery. It was stable, modest, a start. Thomas declined. "A man like me doesn't belong behind a desk," he said. But the truth was, his pride wouldn't let him start again. In his late 70s, Thomas ended up in a care facility. He walked slowly now, spoke less, and avoided mirrors. One afternoon, he overheard a nurse say, "Gina Reinhardt's coming today. She funds the new wing." The name punched him in the chest. Hours later, she walked in, still powerful, still graceful. Thomas watched from a bench, heart pounding. He wanted to speak, to apologize, to explain. But pride whispered, "Not now, not like this." So he stayed silent, and Gina passed by, never recognizing him. Just another old man lost in time. Days later, a young man visited the facility. He approached Thomas with a warm smile. "Mr. Thomas, you once mentored me, remember? I work in London now. You gave me my first chance." Thomas blinked. His memory fogged. The young man continued, "I always admired your eye for truth in art. You saw stories where others saw strokes. I never forgot that." He offered help, money, a place to stay. Thomas stiffened. "I'm not a charity case," he muttered. "I'm still Thomas Reynolds." And the young man left, sadly. Another opportunity, gone. Years passed like falling leaves. Thomas sat in his room, surrounded by nothing but silence and shadows. His hands trembled, his voice barely a whisper. He thought of Margaret's face, serene, Gina's fire, the painting, the laughter, the moment that could have changed everything, if only he had just said, "I'm sorry." Tears fell onto wrinkled hands. "If only I had swallowed my pride. Just once," he said. And for the first time in years, his voice cracked with truth. That night, Thomas slipped away quietly, unnoticed. No funeral was held, no obituary written. Just a name in a dusty file, once remembered, now forgotten. But his story lived on, passed down in quiet whispers. And at the entrance of Harbour City Auction House, a new plaque stood tall. "Pride blinds, humility enlightens. Choose wisely. Before your choices, choose your fate.